Happy 2020, everyone. Like it or not, it's a new year, and I'm back after taking some time off during the holiday season to be with my family. I've been working on some new content for 2020 in the meantime, including a review that's going to be coming up soon of the Sigma EFM 30mm f1.4, as well as the very similar Canon EFM 32mm f1.4. I'm testing both of these lenses, just like I did last time with the 24mm Sigma review, using the EFM mount Canon M50. So you can expect to see that video coming up pretty soon here in the new year. I also traveled last month to Death Valley, California for a week of landscape photography. I have some video content from that trip I'll be sharing soon. And then, of course, I have the hundreds of photos that I took while I was out there. I'm actually editing them right now. And so lots of new things happening in 2020. Speaking of new things and the new year, for this video today, I want to kick off the new year by offering some thoughts on what we may or may not see this year in 2020 from Canon. Now, personally, I think 2020 could be a very interesting year for the camera brand. And to illustrate why that is, let's take a look at a timeline of the past few years. In September of 2016, Canon released the 5D Mark IV. I bought it the day it came out. I've been using it ever since. The fourth version of their popular and, at a time, groundbreaking line of full-frame DSLR cameras. Inside the body, a full-frame sensor with a resolution of 30.1 megapixels. Then almost exactly a year later, in August of 2017, Canon released the camera I'm filming on right now, the 6D Mark II, a budget version of the 5D with fewer features, no 4K video, and a lower resolution sensor of 26.2 megapixels. Plus, rather unfortunately, reduced dynamic range. But hey, it did at least have a flip screen. Then again, a year later, in October of 2018, the camera lots of people, including me, were waiting for. Canon's first full-frame mirrorless camera, the EOS R. Lighter, smaller, new user interface controls, plus an entirely new RF lens mount. Lots of new features and improvements on the outside, but inside, the sensor was actually old. For the EOS R, Canon effectively recycled the 30.1 full-frame sensor from the 5D Mark IV. And because of that, I never bought an EOS R, for from an image resolution and quality perspective, it was effectively just a cross-grade from what I already owned. Then about 6 months later, in March of 2019, Canon repeated their pattern of budget full-frame cameras by offering the EOS RP. Fewer features and more limited capabilities compared to the EOS R, a lower price tag, and inside, once again, an old sensor. This time, Canon recycled the 26.2 megapixel sensor from the aforementioned 6D Mark II. So when we look at everything together in one timeline, an important fact sticks out. Canon has not upgraded their full-frame sensor technology since the 5D Mark IV from almost 4 years ago. And if we're being totally honest, the 5D Mark IV was itself a marginal upgrade from the 23 megapixel 5D Mark III released all the way back in 2012. Now, some people will claim that megapixels don't matter all that much, to which I partially agree. Megapixels are a factor only when cropping and when making large prints. And that 30.1 megapixel sensor in the 5D Mark IV and EOS R can create a 13 by 19 inch or A3 plus size print without any upscaling. And in my opinion, that print size is plenty large for most people. But as we know, humans aren't rational creatures when it comes to purchasing decisions. They may not need higher resolution images, but they want higher resolution cameras because that's how cameras are marketed. For example, the Sony a7R Mark IV has twice the resolution of the EOS R with 61.2 megapixels, while the Nikon Z7 has 45. And those numbers are only going to increase in the months and years ahead. So in order for Canon to remain competitive from a marketing perspective, Canon doesn't have to be the leader here, but they do need to keep pace, regardless of whether consumers actually need all those megapixels. For me personally, I'd be happier with increased dynamic range, improved low light performance, and in-body stabilization rather than more megapixels, which I may or may not need. But in order to do all those things, Canon needs to release a new full-frame camera with a new sensor. So what might Canon do in 2020? Well, here are some thoughts. Canon is obviously dedicating considerable resources to their new RF line of lenses and mirrorless full-frame cameras. That's where the energy and innovation is happening. And that also happens to be where the market is moving. No coincidence there. For over the past decade, DSLR sales have declined year over year, while mirrorless sales have remained steady in a contracting marketplace thanks to the rise of mobile phone technology. But that said, right now in 2020, is Canon ready to go all in with mirrorless? Well, in some ways, it sounds like they may be, for a Canon rep was recently quoted in the media stating that Canon was not planning on developing any new EF mount lenses, with EF being, of course, the mount used in their DSLRs, and by the way, third-party cameras like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema 6K. Now that doesn't mean they're discontinuing the EF mount, but rather that Canon is not going to be dedicating resources internally to the development of new EF lenses. Canon is clearly shifting their energy towards RF, which at least right now is a lens mount used only in the EOS R and RP. So all that said, in 2020, I think we're still in a transitory phase between full-frame DSLRs and full-frame mirrorless cameras. And in order to move DSLR photographers like me into the mirrorless world, Canon needs a higher-end EOS R mirrorless camera, a camera with better image quality and higher resolution than the nearly 4-year-old 5D Mark IV. And right now, that Canon camera simply doesn't exist. So my bet is that Canon will extend the life of the 5D by at least another 4 years by announcing sometime in the first quarter of this year a 5D Mark V to be released in the fall of 2020. It will probably use the exact same body and perhaps borrow some of the features from the recently announced 1D Mark III, including support for Apple's new HIF image format, improved autofocus, better video resolutions, and hopefully a higher resolution sensor with improved dynamic range. They could also borrow the fully articulating flip screen from the 6D Mark II. I mean, that alone would be worth recycling and reusing. Then Canon could reuse the sensor from this theoretical new 5D Mark V and include it, once again, in a new EOS R. Doing so would refresh the 5D Mark V for photographers who prefer the ergonomics, the durability, and the weather sealing of DSLRs, while also satisfying the need for higher resolution, full-frame mirrorless cameras to better compete with Fuji, Sony, and Nikon. From a marketing perspective, however, consumers just aren't excited by DSLRs anymore. But if you were starting fresh and buying a new full-frame camera today, would you really buy a bulky, heavy DSLR over a smaller, lighter mirrorless? I don't think so. Because of that, I wouldn't be surprised to see Canon simultaneously announce alongside this theoretical 5D Mark V, a new EOS R, which uses the same new sensor, dual card slots. It would effectively be the mirrorless equivalent of the 5D Mark V. This would help Canon renew and refresh their mature line of 5D cameras, which have been around for over a decade, for another 4 years, while also expanding and further developing their full-frame mirrorless cameras. And by announcing both cameras at the same time, it would give brand-loyal Canon DSLR users like me a clear path to move over to mirrorless, which, by the way, Canon absolutely wants so they can be selling more RF lenses. And if they don't, well, the good news is that there are high-resolution, full-frame, mirrorless alternatives from Sony and Fuji and Nikon that Canon DSLR owners like me could jump over to. Some already have. The EOS R was a great start for Canon, but this year, in 2020, Canon needs to move beyond their full-frame sensor from 4 years ago and refresh their lineup of full-frame DSLRs, and while they're at it, their mirrorless cameras as well. So what are your thoughts about Canon in 2020? Do you think they'll release another 5D, perhaps a 5D Mark V? Will that be the last DSLR? Will Canon release a new EOS R? And can they remain competitive against Sony, Fuji, and Nikon? Would love to hear your thoughts in the comments section below. Again, stay tuned in the weeks ahead. I'm going to have a review video coming up soon of the Sigma 30mm and the Canon 32mm for EFM mount cameras on the Canon M50. Should be a very interesting and illuminating review. I've been working on it and discovering some pretty interesting things about the lenses, and I'll be sharing that pretty soon. If you want to keep tabs and be notified when content like that comes out, by all means, please subscribe to the channel. I would greatly appreciate it. That's it for me. I'll see you next time.